Hey, welcome back to the channel. Just a quick note before the video starts. It won't be a video this time. It will be audio. The video is just not working. So I just decided to remove the video and put up the audio. It is very much worth listening to. That being said, this isn't just something that is important for the Global Methodist Church, but it's a question a lot of churches should be asking themselves. And that is, what is identity moving forward in light of everything that's come before? So with that, enjoy the interview. Welcome back to Practical Christian Lessons. I am Joshua Pearsall, and this is Dr. Pete Bellini. If you don't know who he is has been on a panel with Jeffrey Rickman. That's how, and I've been on one as well. Those will both be linked below. He's been on Jeffrey Rickman's channel before. He's an elder in the Global Methodist Church and currently standing for bishop. So we'll find out, soon what our next generation of bishops may or may not look like. And he's also the professor of church renewal and evangelization in the Heisel Chair. He's the director of Fire Academy and Specialized Certification. You've been with United Theological Seminary. You've written quite a few books, and I'll link some of those down below. You've done quite a bit, and we're here to have a conversation today over something you actually brought up in your panel with Jeffrey Rickman, and something right. I've been discussing on the channel for a bit here, and that is the identity and future of the Global Methodist Church. So just the same preface I've put in with everyone else here. I'm not here to offer disagreement and push back on anything. I'm just here to poke your brain, work through some of these issues, and put the conversation out there for people to be having. With that said, I think it's worth talking about a little bit why identity is essential. Right? Without an identity, eventually any organization will lose its way. That's not to say that Christ isn't our foundation. He absolutely is. But on that foundation, something has to be built. And if we lose our identity, then we are all the more prone to fall into the errors of our ancestors, going all the way back to Moses in the wilderness. So if we don't have a shared community to continue in mission for purpose, we eventually lose ourselves. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Why are we Methodist? Why are we a global Methodist? What makes us distinct from others? And a large part of that's going to be, what is the identity moving forward? Because right now in the Global Methodist Church, there's a wide range of what many people would call like a low church, charismatic end, all the way to people leaning towards very high church Anglicanism. That's a wide range. Something needs to be there to either hold everything together or something's going to give. So that just important context. In your panel with Jeffrey, you described 4 views, and you've got a 5th one to add today. Maybe some modifications since then, since you've had some time to reflect on this. But the first was recovering or retrieving early Methodist essentials. You called it as primitivism. Capture the spirit of early Methodism with a modern contextual update. There's one where there's the Holiness Tradition, where we become more of a holiness tradition, but are more influenced by the past 100 years of holiness interpretation. And then the last option you said there was a more of a mere Wesleyanism, sort of like a modern, what many people would think of evangelicalism as a very broad movement, but with a more Wesleyan focus. So that's the 4 views you outlined there, and you're welcome to introduce the 5th you've talked about, and we'll walk through these one by one.
Great. Thanks for having me. And the identity piece is so important. And, because for me, the whole idea of thought is what will our future look like? Which Methodism or Methodisms will be our primary influence in shaping, that future? Because we have no common defined Orthodox standpoint in terms of a Wesleyan tradition from which to build a shared identity for the Global Methodist Church. We affirm our doctrinal standards, our book of discipline. We share a lot of common beliefs in terms of the great tradition, but in terms of how we interpret Methodism and how that will bear on the future of what the Global Methodist Church will look like is I think it remains to be seen. And so long story short, I came up with these 5 alternatives. There's a lot more, and they're not clear-cut dry categories. There's a lot of overlap. Some may find themselves a little in one and a little in the other, I don't anticipate anyone saying, "Yeah, that one category is me and that's it." But all that said, I have 5 types. Type 1 is what I call primitive Methodism, and we can get into all of these. Type 2 is Methodism 2.0. Type 3 is the Wesleyan Holiness Tradition. Type 4 is Big Tent Evangelicalism, and type 5 is Anglican Methodism. So they're somewhat similar to the original that I had given in that podcast that you picked up on. They've changed a little, tweaked a little, and then added one. So I'm ready to go, one at a time if you want, or however you want to handle it.
Yeah, I think one at a time. Just start at the beginning, primitive Methodism,
Right.
and just go in order. So if you want to give a bit about what you've seen people discussing there, and how people are trying to interpret it that way.
Right. These are just abstract ideas, and I see that some may gravitate towards these. With this type, we kind of renounce our liberal progressive past as we're looking for a tradition, because many of us global Methodists came out of the United Methodist Church. And as far as our Methodist line goes, our Methodist tradition, we have not had a common shared conservative Methodist tradition since the turn of the 19th century. And so none of us have a living memory of that. So what tradition do we draw from? In this case, we jump over our past liberal progressive tradition and go straight to the source, ad fontes, as we say theologically, and that is John Wesley Methodism. So this more involves, again, bypassing our liberal expressions of the United Methodist Church, that is our Methodist traditions of what the Methodist Church and the Methodist Episcopal South and North and Protestant Church had looked like over the last 100 years of basic liberalism, and go back 300 years to our Methodist roots. With primitive Methodism, adherents retrieve what they believe to be the early Methodist essentials that they gleaned from foundational Methodist documents like the standard sermons, the notes, the articles, the minutes, stuff that's in our discipline, and apply them today in various contexts. And the focus is on originalism or textualism rather than more of a fluid contemporary interpretation of our early Methodist heritage. So basically, primitivism intends to pick up today where John Wesley and Asbury left off then. It understands early Methodism, flaws and all, as the golden era and the gold standard for what Methodism is to be today and tomorrow. And as the gold standard, early Methodism would be the measure by which we judge our Methodism, currently and tomorrow and for the future. This understanding kind of says that we can't go forward until we first go back and take and understand who we are in terms of early Methodism. Then we can go forward. So we got to recover our roots, and we're pretty to the letter about that. That's what I see as the first one.
Okay. I say I definitely have some personal favor towards points there. I'm interested to see where I might fall as we work through this. So when you're talking about them, and I've seen this as well, people who want to go back to the beginning, that's the golden age. And not everyone necessarily overlooks the flaws that were there in early Methodism and some of the battles we had to deal with. I have seen a resistance from that sort of side to look at any later Methodist and to ask the question of what does those principles applied look like in our context.
Right.
I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've seen a lot of people who've maybe wanted to make us as a context and culture go back in time rather than apply it to what's going on today. Have you experienced a lot of that with people with this idea of primitive Methodism that you've seen?
I've kind of seen it go both ways, and the latter that you mentioned kind of overlaps into type 2. But obviously people know that, besides the flaws, the contexts are different. And so you're never going to be able to replicate the context. But as much as possible, this particular group wants to go back to, how Wesley did it, band meetings, class meetings, that sort of thing. And apply that for today, and the doctrinal standards. Basically, it's our model, it's our paradigm. How do we know who we're supposed to be? Well, that's what we're supposed to be. Wesley showed us, and so there's a degree of contextualization of that, but when you begin to contextualize it a lot, I think then it becomes the second one, and where there's a little more flexibility in the interpretation of maybe what Wesley laid down, and which is in our doctrinal standards.
Okay. I think that's probably a good time then to talk about what does Methodism 2.0 look like in a lot of the discussions you've seen going on around.
Right. This is classical or primitive Methodism with an update. It's not hardline about literally recapturing early Methodism, although it honors our heritage. It doesn't romanticize it. Wesley's Methodism had its warts and all. Methodism 2.0 would recognize that we live in a different time and place than 18th century or 19th century England. And it recognizes the firm foundation built by early Methodism, but it doesn't seek to recreate it literally, although it holds firmly to the doctrinal standards and other principles. The value of our early Methodist tradition is found with this group in contextualizing the spirit of Methodism for today. It values our early Methodist tradition, but is not intent on its literal reconstruction as a way forward. It seeks to implement the spirit of Methodism in our current world. That's the update part. It holds to the Wesleyan doctrinal emphasis, but may construe them hermeneutically as multivalent, though still with an evangelical milieu, multiple ways of looking at, our standards that we've inherited. This approach is aware and open to the ways in which the Spirit has been working mightily from ever since Wesley's day to today, especially in terms of the global South and the majority world. That's the update language for the last 150 years. What has God been doing? And so this group is more interested in first building the kingdom, maybe rather than Methodism. So it's looking to kind of what has the Holy Spirit been doing since that we could be a part of. So Methodism 2.0 is open to old and new waves of the Spirit that have moved through the church and the world following early Methodism, such as the Holiness movement, especially the Pentecostal charismatic movement. This Methodism 2.0 will attempt to follow the Spirit, the pillar of cloud or fire that has moved since Wesley, and incorporating that. So a focus on, the person work of the Holy Spirit. It's Trinitarian. It focuses on regeneration and sanctifying grace, but also charismatic grace and its missional implications. I could have called this the Methacostal type, but I didn't want to make it that rigid. But I see that that's one way we've looked at updating early Methodism, is looking at, what the things God has done since, especially in the two-thirds world. There's kind of been a Pentecostalization of Christianity over the last 150 years across denominations. So that would be the 2.0.
Yeah. And I'll actually start at the end there with that last bit. You said that, a Pentecostalization of other groups. I talked about this with Kendall Meek. I recorded his interview earlier today. And one of the things I've seen that wasn't around like 100 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, there's like a very charismatic branch of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, whereas that didn't exist more than 100 years ago. Of course, there's always been mysticism and movements like that. Nothing like, it looks like Pentecostalism in Rome or in the East. So, it has developed a lot. I'm curious, and maybe this moves more into the holiness tradition question, but when you see the sort of Methodism 2.0 side, and I've talked with quite a few people, I think, fall into this side. I'm leaning towards that in myself. There's this importance of what the Spirit's done and not neglecting the movements of the Spirit. Do you think there is an appropriate look at, safeguards to avoid some of the extremes we see in some of the charismatic overreaches that have happened. Clearly, they're not all the same, but there have been excesses, and that's what always, of course, gets the headlines and gets the news.
Right, right. And if anyone's familiar with any of my work, my writings, or my students, like lectures or the numerous podcasts I've done, I talk on this a lot. I'm a big stickler on a balanced approach for a holiness movement to be about, holiness and power. The two go together, and holiness is a ballast for a movement that is looking to be open to the charismatic gifts, because there have been those excesses. The Pentecostal movement, as you alluded to, starting in the 1950s till today, has hit every denomination. There's been charismatic groups and organizations within every denomination, including within the United Methodist Church. And so it has impacted heavily these denominations. And hopefully we've learned things from that. And I believe that our holiness tradition, and we can get into that afterwards, the type 3, offers the perfect corrective for that kind of seeking of the charismatic gifts in a way in which I believe the Pentecostal charismatic movement has not. They've put even though in its early tradition, I mean, the Azusa Street Revival, the fountainhead for American Pentecostalism, and one of many fountainheads for global Pentecostal charismatic movement, came primarily out of the Wesleyan holiness tradition at first. So they had a very strong background in a holiness traditions and in entire sanctification as a framework for thinking about their Pentecostal experience. But that gradually subsided, especially when the movement incorporated more what they call Baptistic traditions that have a progressive view of sanctification rather than the entire sanctification view of Wesley. And eventually, in my estimation, had deflated their theology of sanctification even further and further, where it has been replaced by, self-help, self-actualization, the prosperity movement, health and wealth, all these sort of American caricatures of what God wants to do with us as believers, the self, which is holiness folk, we believe, crucifixion, not inflation of the self. But that's where we offer the corrective, and Wesley did. Wesley judged the fruit of movements of the Spirit in his day by what I call a holiness hermeneutic. And that is, he interpreted those works and those phenomena based on the fruit they produce. Did they produce holiness, or did they just draw attention to the person that was operating in those gifts? And he had those people in his day. Even though Wesley and early Methodists saw the supernatural, plenty of it, they also had persons like George Bell, Thomas Maxfield, that got into the excesses, and Wesley, had to discipline. He had to correct them meekly, but yet firmly. And so I believe our focus on it was Wesleyans, and on fruit over gifts, holiness over power, and character over charisma, not to the exclusion of those other categories, but in terms of what is priority, what's primary. That is what will make us different in terms of our application, implementation of the gifts of the Spirit. If we stay true to our Wesleyan holiness tradition, our emphases will be different. Whereas in a lot of charismatic Pentecostal groups, and I'm very familiar with them, I've preached in them, done renewals and revival in them, very, very familiar. In fact, before I was in the Methodist tradition, I was in that tradition. The primacy seems to be to focus on the gifts of the Holy Spirit and manifestations. And that's a problem. Seeking them, yes, the Bible tells us to earnestly seek the gifts, but it's the prioritization that the gifts are given to us by God. They're not things that we could just conjure up. They're not based on our merit or holiness or anything. They're gifts from God. They're grace gifts. And so we can't claim any kind of first-class Christianity as a result of it. The fruit, on the other hand, is cultivated in us. That is how we judge our own lives and the work around us and others, is them by their fruit. A good tree produces good fruit. And Wesley also, when he looked at the assurance of one's salvation, the assurance of one being in the will of God, he had two, tests, right? The inward witness, which the Holy Spirit witnesses directly to their spirit, and the outward witness, which is the fruit that is produced that I can see and others can see. And so in that regard, I think if we implement our tradition, we have a good framework on how, what I call fire in the fireplace. Fire is good, but if it's not in the fireplace in the house, it can burn the whole house up. But if it's in the fireplace, it's in a framework, it's in a structure, and its function can keep the house warm without destroying it.
Yep. Yeah, I know. And I talked with Kendall earlier today. I liked his phrasing. He said it includes the gifts, but is not about the gifts.
Right. Exactly.
And that's a big thing. And I know for a lot of people, when I've talked with them, when they hear, evaluating things by fruits of the Spirit, some people think that means speaking in tongues. That means
those are gifts.
Healing. Those are the gifts, not the fruit. The fruit is gentleness, kindness, peace, patience, love. And that's why, that's fruit to evaluate.
Well, that's why that love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, it's sandwiched between 12 and 14, which talk about gifts. And see, some people, on the other hand, will juxtapose the gifts, and they'll say, well, God doesn't want us seeking after those gifts. He wants us seeking after the best gift, which is love. I've heard that so many times. Yeah. I'm sorry, friends. Love is not a gift. I don't see it in the Bible anywhere. Love is a fruit, and love contains all the other fruit, in my opinion. I mean, love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, meekness, and temperance. Those are the fruit of the Spirit according to Galatians 5. But when Paul breaks down love in 1 Corinthians 13, when he allows the light to go through the prism and looks at the various components of love, it comes out to be, patience, gentleness, and all of that. It's the fruit. So it's not an either or in this case. We're like, well, don't seek the gifts, seek the best gift, which is love. No, it's seek the gifts earnestly. But he gives us, chapter 13, the method on how we're to seek, operate, and walk in the gifts. And that is in love, because that is what abides forever: faith, hope, and love.
Yep. Before we move on to the Wesleyan holiness tradition, I think it's worth just highlighting the difference seems to be between the Primitivism and Methodism 2.0 is that focus on what the Spirit's been doing since John Wesley, whereas that first movement's focused on.
And we need an update. We've been in suspended animation. We've been in coma, traditionally speaking, as conservative Methodists that were within the United Methodist tradition, and kind of missed all of that. I mean, as United Methodists, we never heard, or in seminary anywhere, hey, about the Azusa Street revival, or even the Holiness movement, or what God's doing in the global South, and how we need to catch up on it. We were only told, hey, this is what's going on in the culture, and we need to catch up with what's going on in the culture. So we're waking up, and we need an update as to what God's done, because we want to incorporate that into our Methodism, because we're more interested in the kingdom than we are in replicating just early Methodism.
I think that's a good time then to move into the Wesleyan holiness tradition, which you have certainly a lot more experience here with this than I do. So I'm very interested in your thoughts.
So this will be type 3, Wesleyan holiness tradition. And this focus will be like the holiness tradition is focused on our doctrine of entire sanctification, or holiness. This is our grand depositum and the center around our identity. Our identity needs to be formed around this: becoming a holiness church, one whose main thrust is entire sanctification. This would involve in adopting the broader historic holiness movement as our tradition. So again, which Methodism? We don't have a real tradition to build on following John Wesley because of our progressive liberal roots, which we've kind of cut off coming into the global Methodist Church. So in this sense, we be grafted into the historic holiness movement as our tradition, and that'll be our lens from which we go forward. We would be grafted into the larger holiness movement of with the Free Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church, the Church of the Nazarene, Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, Salvation Army, and all of those groups that were formed in the mid to late and even early 20th century out of Methodism, when Methodism was starting to become more liberal, as was Christianity in general. And we had the fundamentalist modernist controversy, where a lot of conservative denominations broke away from the more liberal ones. Well, we had that happen a little earlier with the holiness movement in the mid-late 19th century. So we would be intentionally replacing our kind of United Methodist heritage with a tradition which we more readily can identify. In this way, we'd be embracing a particular historic interpretation of our early Methodist roots, a traditionally Wesleyan holiness one. So we still have the early roots of Methodism, obviously, but we're focusing on entire sanctification and honing in on that like the holiness movement did. And so being grafted in that tradition would provide us with, an orthodox historical continuity from Wesley to today, a kind of a common conservative scriptural Wesleyan ecclesial tradition. And that would define our identity, shape our doctrine and formation, and launch our trajectory into the future. Now, of course, the Wesleyan holiness tradition is not a monolith. It's not just, it has a diversity within it, but it's within usually that which we hold together in the greater Christian tradition, and our early Methodist roots, and then the 19th century interpretation of those roots. So it's not a monolith, and there's still diversity in there, but by definition, entire sanctification is still the key that opens the door to this tradition, even though there are diverse views on entire sanctification and other issues among those who identify as Wesleyan holiness. And of course, they're not without their problems as well. So for example, denominations within this movement, in terms of looking at diversity within a Wesleyan context, they may have different issues that they got to resolve, like the charismatic movement. That's been a biggie when the Azusa Street revival hit and drew a lot of people from the holiness ranks. The holiness movement reacted defensively and said, no, we're not doing that speaking in tongues and gifts thing. And they would put it in their disciplines. Sometimes with like the Nazarene Church, it's called a manual, but in their doctrinal standards, often they spoke against the charismatic movement. Now, lately that's changed. Even those Wesleyan holiness denominations are getting an update, like the Wesleyan Church, who now has a favorable and an open view to the charismatic gifts. So you're going to have some diversity in there, and diversity, like for example, in atonement theories, which theory of atonement best fits, or modes of baptism. So there's still going to be some diversity within it, and nothing's going to be uniform. You're always going to have some diversity, and you're going to have tension and issues. So that's number 3, is the Wesleyan holiness tradition.
Gotcha. And so, I don't know if this would necessarily import, and Methodism has historically been very sacramentally focused, having very high sacramentology, not necessarily everywhere today, like everything, there's been variation and things have changed, but officially in our official documents, we're still that way. I know in the Nazarene Church and others, their sacramentology isn't necessarily that way. I've had that conversation with quite a few people in the Wesleyan Church as well. Some of our seminary textbooks have, for example, been written by Wesleyans arguing that their own group needs to be recovering the historic sacramentology.
Right.
Do you think that would something that if the Wesleyan holiness tradition became, say that for those who have this Wesleyan holiness tradition focus, do you think that's something you see more often in these circles, as a lower sacramentology and a higher view in exchange for lifting up other things?
Right. Yeah, I think as a whole, I think you captured it well. I think the overall Wesleyan holiness tradition has often been seen as having a little bit of a lower sacramentology, and some even to the point of thinking them as ordinances and even using that language. But I think that's changed a lot over the years. Over the last 30, 40 years, you've seen a lot of change within those denominations towards using liturgy and having higher views of the sacraments. And some of them, members of these churches, kind of moonlighting and going to Catholic churches or going to Eastern Orthodox, and then a lot of them leaving. Yet a lot of Nazarenes go to the Eastern Orthodox Church, so they saw the value in the sacraments. And I think that if we had global Methodists that were going towards this Wesleyan holiness tradition, they would bring that with them, because it's hard to find global Methodists that have, I guess they do exist. Maybe there are some, Methodabaptists that kind of have an ordinance view, but that's surely a minority. But that would definitely be an issue, is to, as if they're going in, adopting this Wesleyan holiness tradition. Well, how far are we going to go back and, in terms of looking at Wesley, which a lot of these holiness movements are doing, and go, wait a minute, Wesley had a higher view of sacraments than we do. And thus, again, that's why a lot of Wesleyan holiness denominations are moving towards more liturgy and a sacramental view. But yeah, in the past, you're right. They traditionally are more of a low church.
So that would be an interesting thing to see.
Yeah.
Maybe if the Global Methodist Church went this way, that would help lead to those reform efforts. You never know. Is there anything else you want to talk about there really quickly before we talk about Big Tent evangelicalism?
Right. No, I think that's it. Basically, the focus on entire sanctification. Especially, let me highlight this. This is the big difference to what we do in Methodism, in global Methodism today. It will be a focus also on Wesley's tension between the immediate, instantaneous aspect of entire sanctification and the process that precedes and follows it. We talk about entire sanctification more and more in the Global Methodist Church, and I love it. It's great. But we don't talk a lot about its instantaneous and immediate aspects, that it is available for us here and now. And we don't see that woven into our services, our liturgies, that we can actually pray for and expect, like Wesley did in his day, and the Wesleyan holiness tradition did, that God still does that work of entire sanctification. It isn't just a Platonic ideal in the sky that we're always approaching, but we never arrive at. That it is something that is very realistically available by faith, as Wesley said, as we are right now, as Wesley said in his sermon, A Scripture Way of Salvation. And it's something that is immediate and instantaneous, followed by a lifelong work of growth and grace. So I think that'll be a big difference from how we look at that particular doctrine of entire sanctification. It's really going to focus on a very particular interpretation of it.
Okay. Next then is the Big Tent evangelicalism. And this is something I know for a lot of my friends, they've had actually a big concern. Is this what we're going to go? I know David Watson, I'm pretty sure it was last year. I interviewed him recently, and he said one of the things he's been talking about is, if we're going to be Methodist, we should be Methodist. If we're going to be the Big Tent, that already exists in other denominations. Why would we do that ourselves?
Right. Yeah. And that expresses a very clear view that would be anti this type 4 Big Tent. So this next option, Big Tent, go Big Tent evangelicalism, still maintain our Wesleyan distinctives, but we're going to hold them in tension with something that this group would see as bigger. So in defining and carrying out our doctrine and mission, this approach would work with the orthodoxy of the great tradition, and the orthodoxy of evangelicalism, and pick out which evangelicalism, a lot of look at maybe Bebbington's 4 points. He talks about conversion and the cross and those sort of things, and combine that with Wesleyan distinctives, but with boundaries and definitions that have softer, rounder edges that would kind of allow for more diversity on the finer points within orthodoxy of the great tradition and evangelical Wesleyanism. So there's a little bit softer edges for a broader appeal, to the greater evangelical tradition. And they would cite Wesley actually for this. They would say, well, Wesley was not a Calvinist, but he said that Methodism was a hair's breadth from Calvinism. And he worked with George Whitefield. And, the Welsh expression of Methodism would be an example. They were called the Calvinistic Methodists. Almost seems like a paradox or an oxymoron. But there was room enough within the tent to have even Calvinists, believe it or not. So, but one objective would be to accommodate the wide range of evangelical Wesleyans that form this new denomination. So, thus, this approach would be more open to differing views of, infant and adult baptism, the nature of episcopacy, the definition of inerrancy or scripture, kind of like what some of the things that the Jeffrey Rickman podcast dealt with, issues of continuationism in the charismatic movement, all of these tensions, the extent of depravity, theories of atonement, within broad evangelicalism, like the National Association of Evangelicals, they all fit under this big umbrella, but they have tension in all of those areas. There's not uniform thinking on those areas. So this type would have folk that, that believe in inerrancy and others that don't, others that agree on infant baptism and others that don't. They'll look at maybe even more focus on believing, not just adult baptism, but believers baptism. Some may not be keen on the nature of episcopacy. We already have a different view of it in the GMC than we do in the UMC. It's tending more lightly towards congregationalism. Well, that's kind of more like our Reformed evangelical brothers and sisters, and they may want to see more of that power in the local church. And then within this view, you're going to have maybe continuationists in terms of the gifts, and then you may have some cessationists. Different views on depravity. We discussed that in some of the articles. So this type focuses on an evangelical view of Wesley's Catholic spirit, within the body of evangelicalism, not what we saw how it was interpreted in the United Methodist Church, a Catholic spirit that we're one with Unitarians, Buddhists, and everything else. So this is more of an evangelical take on Wesley's Catholic spirit, and and we'll even acknowledge faithfulness in other traditions, and we'll it almost kind of reminds me of like the evangelical free church, even though it's Reformed basically. I know a lot of people within that tradition that are charismatic, even Wesleyan. It's open to that. It's a broad evangelicalism.
Yep. I also think of the Evangelical Covenant, if you've heard of them.
Yeah, there you go. They both have similar origins: Evangelical Free and Evangelical Covenant. Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
I know for a lot of people, they're not necessarily fans of this, but I remember a discussion I've had. I know quite a few younger Methodists, especially, who really are on board with some of the more Calvinist side of things.
Yes.
And in that point to this feels a bit more like pulling from that primitivism side, where it's like, yeah, in Wesley's day, this was the case. But, as Methodism develops, we even see in Wesley's own lifetime, when he brought forth his abridgment of the Methodist articles, he clearly made it to where the Reformed leaning theology of the Anglican Church was not there. Right. The 25 articles that the conference confirms is still very much in line with a part of the Anglican tradition, right, but it did excise part of that. And that's a big thing that the Wesleyan tradition developed and decided it did not want to allow. And that's a big debate I've seen there. So I could see definitely for some people who are more open to the Calvinist side being on board with something like this. I'm not sure how widespread that is, but that is something I've seen in a few circles there.
Yeah, I have too. They've been influenced by a lot of of Calvinism has done a better job, the Calvinists out there, than us Methodists in terms of getting their message out there, packaging it, stating it in a way that is user friendly. They've done a great job with that, and some of our Methodists and I have gleaned and have drawn from those streams, because in United Methodism, when we were there, we're kind of theologically in captivity, and conservatives were not getting what they needed in the local church or from the denomination. So they drew from other streams, to stay alive or to know, hey, what do I really believe? And so some of them, they were influenced by Calvinism.
I guess that brings us to the last one. And this one I have seen a large rise in, especially younger Methodists who are sort of upcoming. Maybe you can tell me if you agree with my thought here of why I think this is. there's been this big question of like authority and tradition, and sort of for a long time, the church has a tendency to pendulum swing from one extreme to another. And I think we've come out of one end where there was a pendulum swing away from tradition and authority and suspicion towards those things and rejection towards those things. And now not just the church, but the culture is sort of swinging back the other way and looking for something more traditional, looking for some of those older historical roots. And I think that's, in Methodism, brought this leaning towards the Anglicanism history and roots.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there has been a pendulum swing in terms of, distrust of authority, distrust of ecclesial structures, distrust of, denominational names and traditions and all of that. And thus, at one point, from the 60s to like the 90s, a gravitation then towards the non-denominational, that somehow that was holier because we're not, God's not about a denomination, that sort of thing. So we transcend that. But no, I think you're right. The younger generation, they're looking for direction and guidance in the age, in this information digital age we live in. There are too many options, and that could be mind-boggling for people. And so they want their lives simplified. They want the path made clear. So they want a light shown to give us the old landmarks, like the Bible calls them, or the old paths. Yep. And so they're looking for that tradition that hasn't changed, where today everything's changing every second. They're looking for those timeless truths and institutions that carry and transmit that timeless truth. And so they're looking for the authority and tradition of, a lot of them are going back to Catholicism. They're going back to the Eastern Orthodox Church. They're going back to Anglicanism, or a denomination like the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, being launched in light of that sort of desire that people have. So yes, I see that within Methodism, and not with young people, but not just with young people, older Methodists that really would like to see that dimension of Methodism emphasized more and highlighted more, like Wesley did. And so that's type 5, Anglican Methodism. So this is kind of high church Methodism, as we shared. It expresses a desire to return to Wesleyan early Methodists, just like the Primitivists, but specifically to return to the Anglican Wesley, who created a little Methodist church, an ecclesiola, within a larger Anglican church, the ecclesia. So Anglican Methodism would, incorporate, liturgy more, incorporate even the Book of Common Prayer into our life of worship and devotion, not only holding firm to the pattern Wesley gave to the American Methodists, but again, to bolster it by drawing from the Anglican Mass and its rich liturgy and Eucharistic theology, and then even, perhaps from other traditions. And this would satisfy, obviously, the desire for those within the GMC to have historical church mooring, to be tethered to the historical church, so that we aren't, flipping and flopping and changing and that sort of thing, which I think is a big part of this, that Protestantism is being seen more and more by young Christians as kind of a make it up as you go along, or it multiplies by division, and it lacks the authority that you would find and that they see that we would need in a high ecclesiology, which incorporates, of course, a high ecclesiology is going to incorporate a high view of the sacraments, a high view of tradition and liturgy, and those sort of things to direct the Christian life forward. So those I see. There's more probably out there, but those are the 5 options that I see in terms of which Methodism or Methodisms is going to shape our future, because it isn't just the GMC's just out there and we just have to uncover it and the future's right. The Global Methodist Church is already resolved. We just have to uncover it and we'll see it. It's there in the doctrinal and the doctrine and discipline of the church. Yes and no. We do have a common great tradition, heritage, and the discipline expressed by the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian formula, and that's great. I love that. And we do have the Wesleyan doctrinal standards, but the interpretation of those is going to, lens for diversity. It's multivalent. And of course, this whole idea of updates of, what God's been doing the last 100 years or so, or those who go, well, wait a minute, Wesley never created himself a Methodist church. He was always an Anglican,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, the history there is complicated because the Methodist movement was complicated.
Yes.
You can say in one sense, Wesley didn't make his own church, but in another sense, you have to acknowledge he did. Because when, England decided after the Revolution that, all right, the American colonies are no longer our jurisdiction. We're not ordaining priests for them. We're not sending them priests. They're their own people now. This is what they wanted. And they decided to sever that tie. Well, Wesley then sent Methodist over, and maybe he thought he could try and maintain a union between the American Methodist and the Church of England, but there's certainly no way you can look at that and say Wesley didn't at that moment, whether he knew it or not, make a denomination. And he was aware he was making a separate jurisdiction that wasn't in union, proper union with the Church of England. So
right, yeah, he knew what he was doing. He kind of felt like he had to do it.
Yeah.
Obviously, what was going on with the colonies in the States and the breaking away. So, yes and no. Was Wesley a denominational Methodist? No, he was Anglican. Did Wesley start something new in England? New denomination? No. Did Wesley launch a new Methodist denomination in the States? Yes.
Yep. Yeah. It's just one of those unfortunate parts of history where politics ended up having a lot more influence in what happened than maybe the theological side did.
Which often happens. Those two are often in dialogue. They're in dialogue. Look at Methodism today, especially the more progressive side.
Yeah, it's definitely a common battle. So before we sort of talk about what your own personal preferences, I think the future of the global Methodist Church specifically is probably finding a core identity amidst this and pulling a little bit from everything. But do you think the biggest reason we're seeing people have these different approaches is because there's not an agreement on how to interpret not just maybe Wesley, but our own history and how things have gone? Do you think that's maybe where this root is?
Yeah, well, I totally believe that. We have no common defined orthodox starting point in terms of a Wesleyan tradition from which to build a shared identity for the global Methodist Church. And we have affirmed the doctrinal standards in the Book of Doctrine and Discipline, but we may not interpret them all the same. But in terms of a shared tradition, most of us came out of the United Methodist Church, an institution that has been basically left of center, for its entire existence since 1968. And the whole Methodist stream has been basically left of center since, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And none of us were around then when it was ever conservative. And so we've all come out of the theological pluralism of United Methodism. And so, sure, as I call them United Methodists, we were in captivity. We had the Good News movement, the Confessing movement, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, trying to find out what our identity is amidst this yoke of this liberal progressive hegemony. But we came out of that. Like I said, some drank from the Baptist wells. There met the Baptists. We got some that drew from the Pentecostals. There met the Costals. We got some that drew from the Calvinist wells. So, we have a common agreement on the great tradition, a common agreement about the doctrinal standards, but we have a lot of flexibility and variety in terms of what those standards mean and the extra kind of little bit of a specifier as to, what kind of Methodists we are, because we do not have that shared tradition. We come with pre-understanding. So, although the great tradition, and Wesleyan heritage, that we're in that, but we're not of the same exact ilk. We don't want to become Wesley bots, but going forward, we need a common ecclesial understanding and culture, and it will emerge one way or the other. But,
Yeah.
out of theological pluralism, we're struggling to identify who we are. And, we're kind of an amalgam of things as a result of that. So, yeah, there's a vacuum there in terms of a common tradition following Wesley to today, where we were basically, in in a coma and are waking up.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my view.
Yeah.
There's micro traditions that are in our denomination.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. Kevin Watson said in his recent book with David Watson, Faith and Fire, one of the opening chapters, he says, when he was going through seminary and being raised up in his education, if you asked people what a Methodist was, there wasn't really good answers.
Right.
Either they weren't specific enough often, or they were sometimes overstating things and being very, very broad and specific. So
right. Well, that was our modus operandi, was to be broad.
Yeah.
We were part of the ecumenical movement, World Council of Churches. That was the whole point of it, was to not emphasize our Methodism, until Albert Outler comes out with this, his book on John Wesley in 1960, I think it was. We weren't taking our Wesleyan tradition even as a serious tradition until then. But that was the whole idea, was the whole project of ecumenism, and within mainline denominationalism, that's the center, is our ecumenism, and being Methodist is more peripheral. The big tent liberalism.
I fully agree. Okay, I'm gonna try. I see our time running down, so I'm gonna try and focus on two things as we close out here. The first is I want to ask you, what is your personal preference? I know you said in your interview with Jeffrey that as Global Methodism moves forward, you're going to be moving forward with it, but of course, everyone has their own preference on what do we think the identity of the Global Methodist Church should be. So what do you think it should be as we move forward?
Well, this is obviously an opinion and preference and taste. I know we have very little time, so you just fill in all the caveats. Okay, I'll start with what I'm not. I'm not type 4. I'm not the Big Ten evangelicalism. I kind of concur with David Watson. If that's the case, then why start a Methodist church? So that doesn't mean I'm against dialoguing with and doing things with other evangelicals. It's not that I don't see Calvinists as my brothers and sisters. I'm in an accountability group with 2 other Calvinist pastors. That's not the case at all. I see them as brothers, but for our denomination, I don't think that's a good thing. I believe we should be in dialogue with these other groups, but as a denomination, not within the denomination. So no to type 4. As a pure category, no to type 5 as a pure category. Yes. I would still like to incorporate and have expressions of high church Methodism within the Global Methodist Church. Yes, absolutely. But to go totally type 5, I'm not there. To go totally type 3, Wesleyan holiness as a tradition, as a pure category, I'm definitely an entire sanctification guy. I'm definitely a holiness guy. And I do believe that needs to be at the center of who we are as Global Methodists. And I would like to call us a holiness church. I believe we are. If we adopt and we have that doctrine of entire sanctification, we are a holiness church. But I think it remains to be seen how much we're part of that particular holiness tradition and how much we want to be, since a lot of those churches are having to figure out their own version of an update, because they also have kind of crystallized within the 19th century, within their 19th century kind of primitivists. And so I like the flexibility of the update. So yes to the Wesleyan holiness tradition and the emphasis on entire sanctification, but no as a pure category, that's all we're going to be. So then that goes down to the 1 and the 2, and I'm probably somewhere in the middle there. Yes to type 1, and in the sense of primitive Methodism, that I look to that as our origin and our source. So I'm very big on those doctrinal standards, and the pattern of early Methodism. the class meetings, the band meetings, the radical evangelism, going to where the people are, marketplace evangelism, strong emphasis on mission, strong emphasis on outreach still, which Wesley did, something I don't think we should throw away from our United Methodist Church tradition. I wish we had a global Methodist version of UMCOR, for example. We really would benefit much from that. So I like the primitivist route, but I want it also open to updates as to what God's been doing 300 years since, including the movements of, like the charismatic movement. So I see that all possible with the Methodist type 2. I see within Methodism 2.0, we could have room for the Holiness Center, obviously, entire sanctification in its interpretation of instantaneous and progressive. We can also have room in that 2.0 for expressions of high church Methodism, because that's definitely part of who Wesley was, and open to then all the charismatic elements of Wesley. But since we're Wesleyan holiness, we're not going to be Pentecostal in our charismatic expressions. We're going to see a new Wesleyan holiness version or modifier. The holiness is the modifier for the charismatic manifestations. We're going to have a totally different look at that. That's not going to be what's primary, but the fruit will be. So I see the type 2, and with that particular interpretation, is probably where I would stand, because for me, in my interpretation of type 2, there's room somewhat for type 1. Yes. In other words, yay to our heritage, but it's not wooden. It's living, it's organic. The same spirit on Wesley's day is the same spirit that moved through the Wesleyan holiness tradition and the Pentecostal tradition. So the update part is big. So I think it makes room for everyone, the best of every one of these, and even the best of the Big Ten evangelicalism. Not that we become a Big Tent Wesleyan evangelicalism, but Wesley was able to work with other groups in terms of his version of the Catholic spirit, which I wholeheartedly agree with, which means we're not fundamentalist in the sense of it's this way is the only way and every other denomination is, wrong or apostate. No, we recognize that there may be another group that does things similarly, and others that may do things different, but have, same goal or same results. It has a kingdom mindset. So my iteration of type 2 is what I would go with if you're putting me in a corner to pick one, and my version is going to incorporate the best of the others.
Okay. Well, I think I certainly favor a position like yours, and I hope that is a very good point of discussion for people to have. I think I'm happy you agreed to come up here so we can actually push for this conversation. I think this is the conversation we need to be having. To that same end, part of conversation includes also reading and doing the study yourself to be informed on a conversation. Wesley, was very emphatic. Anyone who's going to be a Methodist preacher, anyone who's going to be a Methodist pastor needs to be continually educating themselves and continually reading. And of course, we need to be having conversations. So we can't just do one or the other. We should be doing both. So I think we're doing a good job here in trying to platform and push for discussion.
Right.
What would you recommend people be looking to read, either new or old?
Right.
Just you don't have to give a full list. You're welcome to recommend whatever books you'd like. But is there anywhere you'd say, here's a good spot to look and maybe some keywords to be looking at?
Right. For me, the first and the most obvious, and many didn't get this in seminary, is go back to Wesley. Go back to Wesley. Read his journals. Read the sermons. Go back to first source Wesley. We haven't done a lot of that. We got to go back to Wesley and get him down so we at least understand what he wrote. For a good companion on anything that you're reading historically, for when you're reading primary sources, a good secondary companion is anything from my good friend and colleague Ken Collins, any of his historical theological works, and his on Wesley are all, they're all good. His work on holy love, his work on scripture, way of salvation, those are good companions. He also has a good biography on Wesley to read when you're studying Wesley. For an example of an upgrade, read my book Thunderstruck. It's kind of a charismatic upgrade. It goes back and it looks at, Wesley's deliverance ministry, which many have never said. I mean, I think I'm the first person to publish that book, kind of a book, and look at that perspective and seeing Wesley's deliverance ministry. So there's a lot of theology and history in there and practical stuff, but it kind of looks at the need for an update or an upgrade in terms of what the Spirit of God's doing today. But like you said, without making the same mistakes that we did with our excesses in the Pentecostal charismatic movement.
Yep.
So that's just a starter.
Okay. I don't know if you'd agree with Disagreement. I'd also recommend on the same front of Wesley, that we've had lots of great Methodist theologians through the years, Thomas Summers, Richard Watson.
Right.
A recent one was Thomas Oden, and he has his 4-volume. It's a big work, so this would be a commitment. But he has a 4-volume systematic theology of John Wesley. So it's not of Methodism and Wesleyan theology; it's of Wesley's theology specifically, and he did I think a very good job there.
Yeah, and what that will do is it'll help you look at the great tradition that we share through the eyes of a Wesleyan thinker, and many who graduated from Asbury had to use that was the text they used for their theology course. So yeah, Thomas Oden's work is good. Also, if you want to read an older Methodist theologian, William Burt Pope is a good theologian that I would recommend that people would take a look at.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, our time is coming to an end, and you need to get back to conference. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bellini. I look forward to seeing your upcoming work and everything you're doing. God bless, and thank you so much.
Blessings. Thank you.